Imagine reconnecting with the one that got away after 10 years. You're finally single, he's finally single, and the chemistry is still perfect. You mention Valentine's Day, and he vanishes. It feels like a random act of cruelty, but when this woman told me what happened between them a decade ago, I realized it wasn't random at all. This is called ghosting, and sometimes it's not a rejection, it's a recipe. I'm George Duss. I'm a tarot reader. I've sat with hundreds of people in readings about love and relationships. This podcast is where I share the patterns I see. No fortune telling, no mysticism, just psychology of modern dating. If you're new here, you can follow the show wherever you listen. Last episode, we talked about what happens when things get weird after a good date. How someone can kiss you goodnight and then pull back the next morning. That's about readiness and pacing. Today's pattern is different. It's about what happens when the same dynamic repeats itself years apart and what it reveals about how we teach people to treat us. That story I told you, that came up in a reading I did recently. A woman sat across me, totally confused. She said, "George, I'm finally single. The timing is perfect. Why did he run?" And that's when I saw the mirror. She thought she was being ghosted. But when we looked at what happened 10 years ago, we realized something uncomfortable. The way you treat someone when you're unavailable becomes the way they treat you when you're finally ready. Let me fill you in on the details from what she told me during the reading. They met in an evening course. She was married, he was single, and discovered that they both loved photography. So they started going on photo walks together, and somewhere on those walks, the line between friendship and something more started to blur. He had feelings for her, and she felt and knew it. She had the same feelings for him, but she was married. So she kept the connection somewhere between friends and more than friends. Close enough to feel the chemistry, but not crossing any lines. And he stayed, because he hoped maybe someday the timing would be right. Maybe if he just waited long enough, she'd choose him. Then the photography group organized an exhibition, and the night of the showing, their connection was very visible, out in the open. A few days later, he stopped responding to messages, stopped showing up to photo walks, and just vanished. She was confused. We were friends. Why couldn't he just stay in my life? But he couldn't. Because they weren't just friends. He had to leave to protect himself. For years, she thought, if only the timing had been right. 10 years later, she runs into him at a coffee shop. She expected awkwardness. Instead, he lit up. They went for coffee, caught up on a decade of life, and she told him she's divorced and single now. When she said that, something shifted in his face. Like the possibility that had been closed for 10 years suddenly reopened. They started seeing each other, and she thought, this is it. The timing is finally right. Valentine's Day was coming up, and she mentioned it casually one night, maybe doing something to acknowledge it. For a second, he smiled and said, "That'd be nice." And she thought, okay, this is happening. And then, nothing. His text slowed and then stopped, and she realized it was happening again. This time, she couldn't blame the marriage or external circumstances. The way he's treating me now is exactly how I treated him then. So here's what's actually happening. 10 years ago, she kept him emotionally close while being unavailable, and he stayed hoping things would change. But when the connection threatened to become public and real, she couldn't follow through. She was married, and she'd made her choice. And he had to leave to protect himself. That's not ghosting. That's a boundary. But from her perspective, it felt like abandonment. Like he gave up just when it mattered most. Here's what the research shows about breadcrumbing. When you keep someone in that ambiguous zone between friends and more than friends, you're creating what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. You give just enough reward to keep someone hoping, but never enough to satisfy. Being breadcrumb creates what's called anxiety attachment to that specific person. Even if you're normally secure in relationships, this particular dynamic trains your body to stay hypervigilant, always scanning for signs of rejection, always waiting for that other shoe to drop. Fast forward 10 years, and she's available. His body remembers a feeling of investing in someone who couldn't reciprocate. And when she mentions Valentine's Day, when things start to feel real, that old alarm system fires. This is what attachment researchers call rational echo. The past dynamic doesn't just fade because circumstances change. It becomes encoded in how you experience that person. So he runs, and she experiences the mirror. The way you treat someone when you're unavailable becomes the template for how they treat you when you're finally ready. Not because you're getting revenge, but because you taught them what the kind of person you are when things get complicated. Let me zoom out to why this pattern shows up so much in modern dating. There's a reason ghosting and breadcrumbing feel like they're everywhere right now. We talked about this in episode 1. Dating apps train you to keep browsing instead of choosing. Everyone's keeping their options open because there's always another profile. But you don't need apps to hinge. You can do it with real people too. She kept them around while being married because it felt good to have that connection, even though she couldn't act on them. 1 foot in her marriage, 1 foot in this chemistry-filled friendship. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She genuinely thought they were friends. But she knew he had feelings and kept that door open just enough to maintain that connection. She liked the validation, the attention, the feeling of being desired, even though she couldn't reciprocate. And from his side, he stayed because he hoped. Maybe she'd leave her husband. Maybe someday the timing would be right. That uncertainty kept on pulling that lever. Then when the exhibition happened and their connection became public, reality hit. She wasn't leaving her husband, and the jackpot wasn't coming. So he had to walk away to stop the pain. Now here's what he learned from that experience. She's someone who keeps her options open. And when she's finally single 10 years later and starts signaling romantic intent, his pattern recognition fires. His internal dialogue probably went something like this. She hedged before, kept me as a backup while committed somewhere else. I'm not being her option again. And here's the brutal truth. She can't argue with his decision because from his perspective, he's protecting himself from someone who's already proven they breadcrumb when it's convenient. Her circumstances change, but his experience of her didn't. Sometimes the damage is already done. And this is where ghosting and breadcrumbing reveal themselves as two sides of the same coin. The breadcrumber keeps you close without committing. The ghoster disappears without explaining. Both avoid the hard conversation about what they're actually feeling and what they're actually capable of giving. Same fear of vulnerability, different expression. And the devastating part? Sometimes the person who ghosts you is the same person you once breadcrumbed. Not as revenge, but as self-protection. So here's what to notice. First, pay attention to the patterns in your own life. If someone is treating you in a way that feels familiar, ask yourself, have I treated someone else this way before? Don't use this to blame yourself. Use it to recognize the pattern. Sometimes we receive back exactly what we gave out. Second, notice when you're keeping someone emotionally invested while you're being unavailable. If you're in a relationship or not ready to date, but you're maintaining an emotional, intimate connection with someone who has feelings for you, that's breadcrumbing. It doesn't matter if you think it's just friendship. If you know they want more and you're keeping the door cracked without being able to walk through, you're creating the conditions for future pain. And the consequences may not show up for years, but it will show up. Third, if you're reconnecting with someone you once kept at arm's length, you have to name the past. You just can't pretend the old pattern didn't happen and expect them to trust you now. The conversation has to start with acknowledgement. I know I kept you around when I was unavailable. I know that I hurt you. I understand if you need time to trust that this is different. Without that conversation, they'll see the same pattern starting again and protecting themselves by running before it can hurt them. And finally, understand that both ghosting and breadcrumbing come from the same place: fear of being seen and potentially rejected. If you find yourself on either side of this pattern, the question to ask isn't, why are they doing this to me? The question is, why am I avoiding by staying in this ambiguous space? If this episode hit home, I'd love to hear about it. Your stories matter, and some of them might become part of a future episode. Every so often, I'll pull cards for listeners who are open to a quick tarot reading on their situation. You can leave me a private voice message right on the website. Just tap the mic icon at the spiritofdating.com website. When you share your story, you're not just helping yourself see more clearly, you're giving someone else permission to recognize their own patterns too. If this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Maybe that friend who wonders why people pull away right when things get real. It helps more people find their way to calmer, more trusting love. This is the Spirit of Dating. I'm George Duss. You can find me at Duss Tarot for personal readings or connect with me on social media. Until next time, leave the breadcrumbs for the birds.